This week's episode of the 42 FM is brought to you by On Post Money.
Welcome to the 42 FM with myself, Gavin Cooney, and Sinead O'Carroll. How are things?
Good morning.
What are we talking about today?
We are looking at your favourite thing, the economic impact report of various sports. Please don't turn off. This will be interesting, I promise everybody. Gav, this is kind of a pet peeve of yours, right?
Yeah, so it's kind of the must-have accessory of Irish sport these days is these economic impact reports. They're not works of fiction, it would be wrong to say that, but they're kind of exercises in putting one's best foot forward and coming up with fantastical top-line sums. So we're going to go through these in the context of the GAA and specifically the Gaelic Players Association, because last week they issued their own economic impact report. Do you want to guess the top line figure for how much Gaelic footballers claim to add to our economy?
Oh, like all those volunteers, you're probably talking that they probably hit the billion, did they?
Hit $1 billion. I mean, they're going to hire you to do their next economic impact report because the actual figure of 591 million now doesn't sound impressive.
Yeah.
More interesting than that is the fact that, well, it was a piece in the Irish Times, an op-ed by Tom Morrissey, the Limerick hurler, at the weekend, asking if the players are the last of the amateurs in the GAA, and basically whether, the GPA want greater grant subvention to make it cost neutral to be a Gaelic player. But I think the more interesting element of the conversation here is to whether it is inevitable or otherwise the county GA players end up being paid.
So the conversation's actually going to be traditionalist versus capitalist.
Yeah.
So so it's going to be more interesting, the economic reports. I'm just going to read a line from one of your pieces on these economic reports, just to make sure people know that it will be an interesting conversation. Gav wrote a few weeks ago, all of these sporting economic impact reports have been GDPified to some extent. And then he says, think of our GDP figures like the world rankings in international rugby. Tick, Gav. A fundamentally inaccurate global indicator to which Fine Gael voters cling to make themselves feel better.
Yeah.
Tick. all your opinions wrapped up into two sentences.
Yeah.
Excellent.
It's all of a piece, our ability to put our best economic foot forward, or leprechaun economics, as Paul Krugman called them. Okay, we had a big reaction to last week's podcast on trans people in sport. If you do want to get in touch with the podcast, it's Gavin Cooney at the42.ie and Sinead at thejournal.ie. We expected a lot of feedback to that episode, Sinead. We got it. Not all of it, I would say, complimentary, or some of it not in good faith, but in fairness, a lot of people did get in touch with some good feedback and in good faith. Just to give a flavour of a couple of those messages, I know on a couple of topics that we didn't talk about last week, Sinead, one of which someone got in touch with me to give their 2 cents on the subject, saying that many parents find the whole situation regarding children being given puberty blockers very scary and would be very scared of what to do if the issue visited their family situation. This then provokes increased interest in the subject because we all know that bad news sells. The sports story becomes a place for the concept to be seen in a public manner rather than a person who, say, works in the local library opting to change their gender.
Yeah, I think that's fair that we didn't raise some. You can't raise everything in a conversation like this, but I think there was a couple of times where maybe we could have mentioned things like puberty blockers or the controversy around Tavistock. But if people are interested in listening to more about this, because one of the things that is often said about this conversation is like, oh, you're not allowed to have this conversation or you'll be cancelled. But actually, like, some of the feedback from last week proved that you can have this conversation if you centre the people in most impacts, if you try and be thoughtful around it, if you remember that there's human beings with their rights and dignity at the centre of it. It is possible to not be cancelled. We have done a lot of work on what happened in Tavistock in the clinic, what has been said about puberty blockers for teenagers. So people can find that in the Explainer podcast. They can find it on the Journal. If they are interested in that, there is really good information out there without having to go down, like, pro and anti-trans people, which is some of the emails we got, oh, you came across pro-trans. I'm like, well, yeah, we're humans. Like, yeah, we came across as pro-human. So, if people want to get in touch, they can. You also got some information about someone we didn't touch on, which is a sports scientist called Joanna Harper.
Yeah, so Kate got in touch to say, disappointed you didn't go into any of the science around the effect of hormone replacement theory on trans women. There is no advantage after 1 to 2 years of HRT, human or hormone replacement theory, and in fact there's a disadvantage in a lot of areas. So that would seem to contradict the science being quoted by World Athletics in their latest guidelines.
Yeah, Joanna Harper, she's a sports scientist. She's done loads of research on this. She is a transgender woman herself and a runner herself. She has done some really interesting work, as you said, on hormone replacement therapy. She has, again, like there are good debates out there. She has debated Ross Tucker, who I mentioned on the podcast last week, another sports scientist who's really interested in this area. They have debated each other on sports podcast on BBC. If people want to check it out, there's also a transcript available if you just Google it. She's really nuanced as well. One of her main lines from a couple of years ago was, the question isn't, do trans women have advantages, but instead, can trans women and women compete against one another in meaningful competition, which is a very nuanced way of looking at it. And she says, truthfully, the answer isn't definitive yet. To counter that, Ross Tucker says the point of it is that the point of the 13 studies that he would point to, which is the ones that we kind of talked about that World Athletics point to, is that there is no evidence at all, I would say, that an inclusion policy would be that it wouldn't be a prudent starting point. So he thinks an exclusion policy is a prudent starting point, given what we know. So they're kind of the two sports science experts debating each other, and that is possible to do.
Gavin Cooney at the 42.ie or Sinead at the journal.ie to get in touch on any subject we've covered, including should intercounty GAA players be paid. So, this is kind of an interesting enough story. Like, I was really struck by this Tom Morrissey op-ed in the Irish Times at the weekend. So it's off the back of, as we say, economic impact report by the GPA saying, lads, we're creating value of almost 600 million euro for the economy, and yet we're on average €1,500 worse off every year across all players, because it's just so damn expensive to play this sport now. So just to kind of give a little bit of the context, the GPA get grants from us, the benevolent taxpayer. They in 2020, so these came in 2007, I think it was, the GPA. We'll remember them as initially quite a militant organisation outside the tent with Desi Farrell and Kieran McGeeney and Donald O'Cusack and DJ Carey, and they ultimately, I remember they threatened strike action, and they ultimately got these grants from the taxpayers. But the GPA now say that these grants need to go up in line with inflation, because while they were increased in 2021, the GPA are ahead of the GAA in the sense that they're an integrated organisation. So the LGFA players and the camogie players are there as well. So while the size of the pie has gone up, everyone's share of it has not. So grant funding has gone from 3 million to 5.6 million to address gender disparities. But the GPA say that male player grants, for instance, have remained stagnant at €1,470 per player since 2018. So they say, lads, along with that, the GPA say they're losing out on €3,500 annually in potential overtime earnings. Now, that seems quite a hypothetical.
Oh, that's part of the 4,500 out of pocket, is like we could be off doing other work.
We could
instead of doing this.
Yeah, exactly. And look, that seems pretty hypothetical to me, but we'll get into it. But the top line figure is we're losing €4,500 every year. We're offering this country nearly €600 million. Lads, sort it out. Let's make it cost neutral to be to be an intercounty GAA player.
When they say that we're, putting this amount of millions, are they saying just county players? Like,
just
how are they dividing the club and the county economic impact? It's
the economic impact of the intercounty game.
Oh, just the intercounty game. So they've come up with that figure. Sorry, when I said $1 billion, I kind of thought the GAA as a whole.
No, see, but that's one of the problems with the GPA, isn't it? That it's kind of it represents intercounty players. And all intercounty players say, we're a club player first.
Yeah.
But this organisation isn't there to represent them.
Yeah.
Because that's why there is a Club Players Association that sprung up for a while to win over the split season and has since kind of retreated from public view. So
one of the phrases I'm most cynical about is when someone says, well, it's the club medal I wanted the most. I'm like, well, you wouldn't say that if you didn't have Sam Maguire or Liam McCarthy. So I never believe you. It's really easy to say that when you have the other one.
So I was really struck by this piece by Tom Morrissey in the Irish Times. At the intercounty level, I'm quoting now, our players the last of the amateurs. Look at Croke Park on All-Ireland final day. Everyone in the stadium is being paid. The administrators in the Hogan stand, the management teams, the physios, the caterers serving drinks, the people selling programmes, the media, the photographers. They're all professionals, but the players are not.
And he says that as they should be. And we have talked about this a lot, the professionalisation of GAA or the semi-professionalisation or the quasi-professionalisation. And when you spell it out like that, it does seem really obvious. Well, yeah, like we're paying into the gates to see you guys. You should be the one who gets the fruit of that.
Mm.
But just the minute you start digging into it, you start finding loopholes into why or how that should happen.
Well, this it kind of leads on to an early kind of Flann O'Brien style contradiction that the GPA, it's in the GPA's constitution that they're there to preserve the amateur status. And they say the only way to preserve the amateur status is to pay us more money via these grants, which again is the kind of weird ambiguity, the weird kind of place of ambiguity the intercounty game has got to.
So where do you land on this after reading all your impact reports?
After reading all my impact reports, I think that the genie is out of the bottle here. I really think that, you know, like as the Tom Morrissey piece refers to, everyone's being paid, including the management teams. He does put a little bracket, exclamation mark, close bracket after that. And if everyone is already being paid there, I think it's hard to put the genie back into the bottle. But what's your view?
So the GAA is a special organisation, and that's what we talk about all the time. And we talk about the club being as important as the county. We do the split season because the club is as important as the county. But if you decide on professionalisation, which this is, so like expenses are a fudge and have always been a fudge. Like expenses have existed since the early 1900s, I think, in GAA, like, you know, where people went to camps and they got paid expenses. Paul Rouse talks about this. I think a lot of it was to make sure gambling didn't become a huge thing and match fixing didn't become a huge thing in the GAA. So we've always had this ruse of expenses in lieu of payment. But if it actually gets to payment, I have these warning bells going off in my head. So I know me and you kind of roll our eyes when we talk about the special status of the GAA, but I do actually believe it kind of like in me that, like, as a GAA person, as someone who grew up in it, that it is very special. It provides a real community. And what does professionalisation do to that at this late stage as well? When I was reading Miguel Delaney's book about sports washing in football, and he talks a lot about the kind of arms race that player transfers became. Once you start talking about professionalisation, you can't really stop transferring of players. So again, this is where the expenses ruse comes in. And I think why the GPA are rightly just saying, well, it just has to be expenses. But where does that stop then? So if we can find a way of making sure that players are remunerated well, but it has to be across the board. It has to be equal, 32 counties, 4 codes. Like, and I just can't see, you know, people like the Limerick hurlers who are getting to the highest echelons of the game, and, you know, the ones who are bringing in the gate and the ones who are, you know, getting the subscriptions to GAA Go. I can't see them being like, okay, fine, like I'll share this with the Mayo Camogie players, you know, I'll share the pot and the same amount. If that worked, great. If it doesn't, I don't know. I just see bad things in our future. And I remember reading Miguel Delaney's book being like, this should be a warning for GAA people. You lose the heart and soul of your game if you go down this route too hard. Yeah,
but is the heart and soul not already really gone? I mean, again, I'm really struck by the kind of knowing nod that Tom Morrissey makes to the management teams. Like, I mean, the managers are already being paid here. Like, he makes quite an arresting point that on All Ireland final day, everyone here is already being paid anyway. And like the GPA are getting grants. They just want, you know, more of these grants, where I'm sympathetic to them. Like, I mean, I think if everyone's being paid here, these are the guys that are actually serving the show here. There's no point being biased about this anymore. Like, the amateur status thing is already dead. Like, it's really an aspiration now. It's not an actual fact. But then I think one of the things when I read like their complaints that we shouldn't be €1,500 worse off every year for doing this, it's meant to be a hobby, and everyone is worse off because of their hobby. Like, a lot of people would say, I go to work so I can afford to pay for my hobby. So again, it's like, even the way in which they're framing it is a little bit like, we're protecting the amateur status, but we demand we shouldn't be out of pocket for this, you know, amateur activity. So I even think that's a bit disingenuous, to be quite honest.
Yeah. So people who are listening who play golf or who play tennis or, you know, go for guitar lessons or go to dance class, or like, well, yeah, all of those hobbies, like, cost me money. So why should you be different, particularly at the cost of the taxpayer? I'm probably going to invoke Paul Rose a lot during this episode because he does some amazing history of sport. He's a historian in UCD, and he does some amazing lectures and podcasts on history and sport. But he did one about the commercialization of sport back during COVID times. It was actually with Joe Malloy from Off the Ball, and they were talking about how in Victorian times that we were brilliant at turning leisure into big industry. They were brilliant at taking the idea of spare time and making money of it. So obviously we have just continued and brought it to the nth degree in by the year 2025. So, they start talking about the end of the 19th century when weekends became a thing, trips to the seaside became a thing, and then sport became a thing. And then there was commercialization around it. People started making rugby balls, people started making footballs. By the early 20th century, sport is awash with money, Rouse says. So then and that's including the GAA. There was, like I mentioned earlier, the gambling thing. So if we're really good at commercializing our hobbies, then obviously we got that's the path we were set in. The GAA always kind of remained outside of that kind of commercialization to a point, but there was always gate receipts. So I think that's the thing which is a bit different to the hobby. There are gate receipts, so they're a product as well. I'm oscillating between two things here. I'm I'm a traditionalist at heart, and I kind of want to keep the amateur status.
But you're a realist,
but I want to put the genie back in the bottle. I want football to be better again. The more professional football becomes, the crapper the sport is, and we try and fix it. And I think all the managers are just toying with us with the league at the moment. They're all going to revert to type when it comes to championship. They'll have figured it out. So in some ways, I want to stop footballers being able to train 5 times a week. Just want them to go back to being able to play twice a week, not like the rugby ethos of old. You're actually not allowed to train. You just all have to go get a football and kick it and catch it as many times as you can, and we'll all have more fun watching it. But then the realism kicks in. You're okay, well, Tom Morrissey makes a good point in that piece about, the spectacle has got better for hurling because of, how well trained they are, the specimens that the hurlers are now, and what they're able to do. I go over and back sometimes. Hurling is it better now than it was 5 or 6 years ago? I don't know. But the point of whether professionalization actually helps the game, but we're already there.
You see, that's
but we're lying to ourselves. We're using this expenses ruse. Why not? Can we not just keep using the expenses ruse?
But but ultimately you can't. When the GPA survey their players and look at how much money they claim to be losing doing this, then you have the ruse. It eventually has to collide with reality. This is what we're talking about with Declan Bogan a few weeks ago on our episode on the revenue audit. There's loads of people being paid here. As one of the best hurlers in the country, he has openly acknowledged in the Irish Times at the weekend. But no one can acknowledge that the money is actually there, because then that's the end of the amateur status. It is a thing that is, to all intents and purposes, dead and has been dead for many years. But people can still cling to it for as long as they repress the notion that people are being paid. And that's why the payments are under the table and not made through any kind of official stipend. So the amateur, I know I'm repeating myself on the amateur thing, but it is long dead. And it's long dead when you see the GPA saying that we're committed to upholding an amateur status, but here's how much money we're losing, and here's how much money we're making for everyone else. So when everything is seen through the prism of money, and this isn't the GPA's fault really, this is a national prevailing view to sports, then I think you just kind of acknowledge that, this thing is absolutely at least a semi-professional enterprise. And in that context, I have no problem with it. In that context, the players shouldn't be losing money for... There was a 2018 ESRI report that said, on average, players are spending about 31 hours a week on their intercounty careers.
But I just think that's too much. They shouldn't be doing that. That's one of the issues of this thing. I think Charlotte Burns is onto something when he says that we just have to define what amateurism is. In decades gone by, one of the big things around the GAA and the paranoia and all of that was it was almost like we're amateur because we're not English. We're amateur because we're not soccer. We're amateur because we're not going to do what rugby did in the more recent decades. This idea that we're a nationalist sport and it's important to us. It's kind of that is a little part of it, but that can't ring true anymore. It shouldn't ring true anymore. So I think we do need to redefine it a little bit and look at the practicalities of it. Like, you can't actually, like, I know it's neat for the GPA, but you can't actually separate the club and the county. Like, you have people like Noel McCaffrey,
But they
Jack
do. I mean,
McCaffrey's
that's
dad.
the GPA. That's what the GPA exists. It
I
doesn't
know,
represent
but
all club players.
like, it's neat for them to be able to say that, but like, they are actually the one and the same person. Like, and the county people who are club people are the most important club people when it comes to the playing of games. And yes, we have tried to commodify the club game, and it's on telly too much, I think. And, you know, there are gate receipts, but it's not the product. Like, the intercounty game is the product. So, and like, there are club players like me who, you know, I need to be out of pocket for playing the game. Like, I'm not good enough to be like given expenses. Like, that would be a crazy use of money. So the practicalities of the county and the club game being separated to the extent, I think, could be the death knell for everything, because then you really go, even if it's semi-professional, you go down the route of professionalisation, and you can't maintain 32 counties. We can't even maintain that on a quasi-amateur status. You have counties that are left behind in both hurling and football. You have counties that are left behind in one or the other, depending on what their main sport is. So if you professionalise it or semi-professionalise it, that the gap is just going to widen and widen and widen. And then you'll have transferring happening, even if you put rules in place to try and fend against that, it'll still happen. You see that in the club game, and it would come into the county game.
It's a Pandora's box, but I do think it's ultimately inevitably going to be prized open. But we will get more into that after the break. So just to pick up on where we were before the break, we've talked all here about outputs. You know, like how much money everyone should be making in terms of grants, in terms of, you know, whatever, in terms of GPA players not losing any more money. At no point is anyone acknowledging the input here. You know, at no point is anyone saying, well, one thing we can do, one of the reasons like players are €1,500 worse off every year, or, you know, ultimately €4,500 worse off every year, because in the GPA's own report, they're losing out on overtime, the potential of earning overtime, is that they spend so much time being an intercounty footballer. At no point has anyone said how to actually preserve the amateur status is to say, let's do less of this thing. Mm-hmm. Let's make this an actual hobby again. Because think about it. The players say the demands are unsustainable. The county boards all say the demands are unsustainable. The provincial councils all say the demands are unsustainable. Croke Park say the demands are unsustainable. But at no point is anyone saying, well, these demands are unsustainable. Maybe let's do something to make them more sustainable. And one instance is like, you know, just intercounty players have to train so much. And one of the flashpoints in the off season was this collective winter training ban with provincial councils accusing the GPA of flouting it. Now, on the day that the GPA launched this report, Tom Parsons, the CEO of the GPA, was asked about it. And he said, look, I mean, and this is an old timer in terms of, as I say, kind of Flann O'Brienisms in Irish life. We have evidence, but not proof of GPA players flouting the collective training ban. So the dogs in the street know there have been at least some counties flouting this ban. But it seems like, and Tom Parsons is just like, look, we all need to work together to, you know, observe this. So it sounds like, well, look, sure, you know, the Gaelic players have run through the gate, but the county board left the gate open. So whose fault is it really? You know, so no one at any point is acknowledging that we need to scale back the demands here. So that's the actually only way of preserving the amateur status, which is already dead. Yeah, I feel I'm kind of losing my mind talking about this thing. We need to preserve this thing that's already gone.
Well, if you train like professionals, which is what every intercounty player says they do, then it is very hard to say, okay, well, we'll scale back, and to trust everyone else is scaling back, which you're like, well, we'll just get beaten out the gate. So you actually have to have trust in each other. But if the players actually mean it, if they know this is the right thing to do, they actually have to be empowered to be able to stand up to the manager, but they're unpaid and the manager is paid, and the county board wants results from the paid manager, which is why you have, you know, a lot of the talk around how counties are doing often lands on the manager being good or bad. It's not quite at the sacking level of the Premier League, but it's
the GPA are the union. Like, I mean, they could act like, just go on strike, lads. I mean, you've gotten for strike for grants in the past. Like, if the demands are really unsustainable, just go on strike or threaten to go on strike. but ultimately what trumps that is the desire to win.
win.
And I respect that,
Or
because
and I think there has to be a bit of honesty in this as well, is the idea of young people actually really enjoy kind of the atmosphere and the kudos that goes along with being an almost professional. You know, that idea that you've sacrificed and you're pushing your body to its limits, you're pushing its mind to its limits, that really appeals to some people. So there has to be that element as well of honesty in it, that like, well, actually you are enjoying it. I know you don't want to be out of pocket for your hobby, but you are enjoying it. And like part of that is because you get the trappings of professionalism, but still be allowed, you know, focus on a different career, or, you know, do it in the sport that you love, if it's hurling or football or camogie, without, you know, it doesn't have to be a professional. You don't have to, you know, go and be Conor Island on a like playing to Afghanistan. You know, you can do it in Ireland, you can do it in the sport you love. So I think that has to be acknowledged as well, that some of it is because people love it and it is a hobby. And I know the GPA do, you know, they all obviously love the game, and they just, you know, feel like they are a product and they are being commodified, so that they shouldn't be the last people to feel the effect of that.
Everyone's commodified. Sorry to go into my kind of Noam Chomsky era here. Everyone in Irish sport is commodified. I mean, when the GPA are again justifying their contribution to society by putting €591 million on it, you know, that is commodifying. But
I think it's obvious, and I think this was one of the things which is probably why it's becoming more acute for the players now. Things like GAA Go, the image rights thing. We heard Shane O'Donnell kind of say, you know, my likeness was up on the GAA Go website and they never asked me. And he said he didn't want anything for it, but they should have asked him, because he would have said no. He didn't agree with the idea of paying streaming website within the GAA. So he was like, well, you should have asked me, and I would have said no, and that would have been the end of it. So this image rights thing is coming up. I think that, you know, people remember the Mbappe stuff with PSG around image rights. That seems to be really unfair. Well, hang on, you can't use my face and name to sell something and like I get no benefit, or you haven't even asked me. So I think there's like these extra bits of professionalisation that the GAA is doing to compete with other sports, and they're really going to have to do it now with League of Ireland growing and things like the Aviva having 33,000 people at it last week. So I think that's part of it. It's becoming more acute. The better the GAA get it, and they're still pretty crap at marketing, but like the better they get at some of this stuff, I think the players feel more commodified, and I think that's fair enough.
This went unremarked upon or under-remarked upon last year. The GAA have already commodified everyone, because they brought out their own economic impact report last year, which said, how's this for a bombastic headline?
How much was this worth?
So how much do you think the Gaelic Games, so that's the four sports, Gaelic Games is worth to the Irish economy every year?
Oh, I was crap at the last guess, but this one must be in the billions.
Yeah, it is €2.87 billion. Roughly the same as the drinks industry is what the GAA yields here. But obviously the drinks
and one doesn't work without the
other. But obviously, you know, look, these economic impact reports, it's a case of kind of don't hate the player, hate the game. I mean, this is how the state views sport. The state brought out like these new guidelines for hosting major events here, and they have to tick a number of boxes. The top one is, how much money is this going to make for the economy? And number two is, will this drive participation? So already you can see how the state
how
views... How
small was the type of that second?
The state cannot understand sport without being able to put a euro beside it. So this is why the GPA have done this. They understand no one will listen to us. We can't get the government to increase our grants if they don't understand how much money we're actually feeding back to them, or we can claim to be feeding back to them. That's the exact same with Gaelic Games. You know, this is how it works. Sport brings out economic impact report, top line figure. We wave this around whenever we want more money. Now, like, this goes back to our old friends at the Horse and Greyhound Fund.
I was going to bring them up because they kind of say they're industries rather than sport. Is this the way that all organisations are going to do?
Genius linguistic trick from the Horse and Greyhound world, that they justify their enormous funding that comes from the Department of Agriculture rather than sport, because we're not a sport, we're an industry. Because, for instance, the horse racing industry will say, we indirectly support 30,000 jobs in Ireland. Now, some of these are obviously very direct jobs, people that I'm
Train
not a
horses.
work with the horses, whisper to the horses, whatever they do. But like another 5,500 of these jobs are in the betting industry. 8,400 are supported through money flowing through the economy. So examples given, jobs in travel, accommodation, restaurants and bars. So, you know, we organise a race at Leopard's Town. There's a restaurant up the road.
Who does well out of that?
They're claiming responsibility for that job. The reality is, like, they're clearly having an economic impact at the restaurant up the road. But would the restaurant disappear if horse racing disappeared? Not
Maybe,
sure.
maybe not.
You know, same with greyhound racing. You know, 4,150 people in direct and indirect deployment. But this includes 300 people in the manufacture, sales, and distribution of dog food. Like, if the greyhounds stopped racing in the morning, like, would like Dog Food Inc. collapse in Ireland? It would take a bit of a hit, but like, it wouldn't collapse. So no, like, there's no lies in these reports, but it's a case of like kind of fairly abstruse methodology and just kind of put your best foot forward here. You know, let's kind of be generous.
Throw everything.
And like the GAA one then, I couldn't believe this when I read it. So 2.87 billion euros. So obviously there's the direct money that's raised through in intercounty games like the GPA one has referenced. They add another 1.224 billion euro worth of social capital. Don't really know what that means. Another 1.056 billion euro is added in the GAA's own report, as it would cost that much to replace the GAA's number of volunteers. Now, tell me what's wrong with that sentence.
This is going to be one of those annoying Schrodinger cat things, but if it's not there, why would it be there?
I know. They've basically said, lads, listen, it would cost us €1 billion to pave O'Connell Bridge with gold. It's just like, well, we weren't going to do that anyway. Who on earth was going to propose replacing the GAA's volunteers? Well, pay €1 billion to pay these people. Frankly, like, no one would... If like people who volunteer in the GAA know that what they do is like, if you were being paid for that, you would be completely demeaned and you would quit. Because people put a price on their time, a value on their time, and clearly the shit you have to do as a GAA volunteer is not worth it. But you do it not for the money, because you're part of something bigger than yourself and you're part of a broader organisation.
Like, the one true thing that people do say about the GAA, which it should not be eye rolled at, is the people who do flags, lines, putting up nets, like cutting grass, are genuinely the best people in the organisation. Like club people of the year every year.
And not to sound like a pious GAA ad, but that stuff is priceless.
Yeah. And again, you couldn't put money, like, if you started giving 20 quids out to the people who do that, it would be insulting.
It's crazy. But obviously, and like the GAA know this. Like, I mean, and it's the same with all these organisations. They're like, this country only understands sport through, I put X in, how much Y can be said to come back to the state at the end of it. And that's how the country views sport. And that's why we read all these things. And that's why the GPA are talking about preserving their amateur status through the only way to preserve the amateur status is to make sure we're not losing more money than we currently are.
But when I hear all those things about money, like the lobbying of the government for money for these things, like the obvious thing for football is to make sure that there's better facilities and better grassroots and more coaches for underage. Like the thing for the GAA is to make sure there's enough facilities for when integration happens, that there's not going to be clubs ripped apart by the idea of women being given equal status. Like, it would be fairly low down my list, would be to pay inter-county players out of the pot that we'd be going looking for.
Do you think it's inevitable that they are paid now?
I think it's inevitable.
How does this end?
I think it's inevitable that expenses get increased. Our producer Ronan Early has had the best idea that I've heard around this, which is a percentage of gate receipts from every single gate of every single intercounty match across the 4 codes. A percentage of that gets ring fenced and gets divvied out between every single intercounty player who's been registered on a panel that year. It's not going to be huge money, especially as gates are going down. If you saw the attendance figures, if you compare 23 to 24, there's some really bad news there for GAA. I think there's probably a bit of work and soul searching to be done. Again, like I said, particularly with the rise of the League of Ireland. Charlotte Burns says we're not in competition with the foreign sports. I'm using quote marks there. But I think maybe a little bit of them has to realise, well, maybe you actually are now. But even if it's a reduced pot, the idea of, okay, yeah, people are literally putting their money like into the GAA to see these players most of it should still go back to the grassroots. I'm going to remain a traditionalist on that. I think that is why we are doing better than, I really slipped there. That's why we're doing better than football and other sports for youth participation, is because it does go back in, because we do have those volunteers, we have that system. So I'd hate to see that plundered. That's very emotive language. This is what happens when you start talking about this, Gav, as a GA person. But the idea of a smaller ring fence portion to go to the intercounty players to make sure that out-of-pocket amount doesn't grow. But I think at the same time, we do have to look at the amateur status and look at how managers see their intercounty panel and work better towards a sustainable welfare system and a sustainable way of training, a sustainable way of being a semi-professional or a quasi-professional or a genuine amateur, so that it opens up the sport to more people for longer, so that it doesn't have to be just students and teachers, and that you don't have to quit when you're 30, and get back to some of the roots of what the GAA should be. I think that should all be brought into the conversation. I don't think any of that should be left off the table. I don't think we should say, right, we're paying people, therefore we're becoming more professional, we're becoming more like rugby or more like soccer. I think we should still try and preserve some of the things that make the GAA special, and some of that is that the club and county player are the same. I was going to mention that Noel McCaffrey thing earlier. Jack McCaffrey's dad has written a piece and has got a motion passed. He's one of the spearheads of a motion that got through Dublin GAA around that the club player must be able to play at least 4 league matches with their club. They must play at least 4 league matches to be eligible for a county, because at the moment they're not even doing that in some places, obviously, because if there's a motion, there's obviously some club players who aren't, county players who aren't available to the club even for 4 league matches. So I think all of that should be in the round and in the conversation. Sorry, that's a really complex answer, but
I think it's inevitable that they will be paid in some sense. The GAA a few years ago, the GAA are really good at commissioning reports that are quite, intelligent and far-sighted reports. A few years ago, they commissioned something called Towards the 150th Anniversary of the GAA, which basically, bring in proposals to, when we're at 150, how do we, keep the GAA going effectively? That this report was brilliant because it's never been published. But there was a good piece in the Irish Times last week by Sean Moore, and some of the details of it leaked out. And some of them in there, unbelievably prescient, advocating, among other things, for the split season, for integration with the women's sports, and a tiered championship, which is broadly the direction of travel. That's where you're going. Also in there is the idea of paying players and managers and abolishing provincial councils. Now, I assume the abolishing provincial councils is the really controversial element there. But I think it's kind of inevitable. There is, again, a good piece by Mick Foley in the Sunday Times at the weekend about the GAA have an amateur status committee up and running now, and it seems that will propose, as Jareth Burns has publicly floated, paying managers a stipend. And when that happens, I believe that it is inevitable that the players will have to be paid one as well. So I think the only way to maintain this amateur status thing is to give them money in some way that doesn't look like you're giving them money. The grant money from the state was a pretty good way of doing that. But now we see with the demands, that's not enough. Now, are the taxpayers going to really stump up for even more of that? Or will they have to get creative in some other way? Ronan's idea is probably the best in terms of everyone gets a cut of the gate receipts and it's equally distributed regardless of what sport you play, where you play it, and how much you contributed to those gate receipts. But, you do that, then down the line, I think people will point out that, well, look, an All-Ireland winning footballer or hurler, filling Croke Park 4 or 5 times a year, and, so-called weaker county player is not really contributing here, and they're getting, the same amount.
This is why I'm so nervous. The minute you start it, the gap just gets wider.
Yeah, but so it's a slow journey, but I think the genie is obviously out of the bottle. So I think they'll be paid, and I actually have no problem with them being paid. But all I would like then for them to just drop is the claim to amateur status, because it's an aspiration that exists at club level, but it doesn't exist at, I was going to say intercounty level, not all of intercounty level, because obviously, if we were to start an industry here, really there's only a few counties that would really kind of prop up the industry. Really, it would look something like the League of Ireland, where you have a handful of, I say a handful, there's now 10 full-time professional teams in the top division, and then primarily semi-pro and amateur teams below that. I think you get that kind of hodgepodge here as well. But I don't see how that is ultimately avoided in the very long term. I don't see how that's avoided.
And it's not a better product than what we currently have, which
No.
is stipend. That's a real Irish solution to an Irish problem.
Yeah, it sure is.
Yeah.
I should mention, like, just thinking, having done the pod now, like, how much could we claim that this episode of the podcast has contributed to society? So obviously, like, people will have listened to it if they're out, like, just buying coffee or something. So, like, the Irish coffee industry must be worth around 200 million euro a year. If you're out for a run, that's obviously a major saving to the health budget. So, like, if all of our listeners listen to this for out for a walk, for a run, I'd say that's a 2 to 3 billion euro saving in the health budget every year. So, I mean, realistically, we're contributing almost like 100% of GDP here, you know?
You could be hired as a consultant in one of the big four. Just
Man.
increase your own stipend.
Oh my God. That would be the dream, wouldn't it?
This is one that's not going away, and obviously controversial as well. There'll be, like, I know myself, I'm really traditional when I think and talk about this, so I'm sure people will be rolling their eyes at some of my naivety. But it's been good to have a chat through it. As always, get in touch with us, Sinead@thejournal.ie, and Gav Cooney at the
42.ie.
God, how have I butchered that again?
Yeah. Gavin Casey took the Gavin at the 42, which I'll never fully forgive him for.
Do you want to do the thank yous?
Yeah, so thanks very much to yourself, Sinead, to Nikki Ryan, to Ronan Early, to Gareth Lyons, to Niall Kelly, to everyone involved for putting together this podcast. We will be back again next week.
Thank you very much.
This week's episode of the 42FM was proudly brought to you by On Plus Money.